hold on. My AirPods are are there. Cool. Um, what up, everyone? Welcome to another live stream here on patellar tendon pain. Let's just get started like we always do. This is week 3 or 4, I think. So thanks everyone for coming back. And if you're new, welcome. Every week we're going through basically just a different injury or pain syndrome for runners, but it's obviously applicable to anyone that's experiencing it. So let's talk about the patellar tendon here. So if we're looking at the knee here, to give yourself a little bit of context for the anatomy, this is the femur, this is the tibia, which is the shin, and then we also have the fibula out to the side here. This is the patella or the kneecap, and then there's a ligament that attaches this kneecap down to this little portion of the tibia. That's called the patellar tendon. And so the muscles up here are the quads, and they taper down into that patellar tendon. And so patellar tendinopathy is very common in jumpers, but for runners, it can also be common, especially because it helps with braking. So as you take each step here, take a step, and then the quads help to slow down as you take that step. And then with that, the patellar tendon can get overloaded, and that can lead to patellar tendon pain. And so how do we diagnose it is maybe one of the big things there. And with any sort of tendon pain, it's pretty straightforward. You obviously want to be able to rule out other things, but with all tendon issues, the pain is very localized. And so for patellar tendon pain, if we look at the patella right here, the pain is typically right at the bottom here, which is where that patellar tendon attaches. And so usually there's going to be pain when you press up and through here, maybe a little bit underneath. The thing that you want to make sure that you don't have is patellofemoral pain. And that's going to be a little bit more generalized pain in the area. And patellofemoral pain, which we did a live talk 2 weeks ago, I think, that pain is going to be a little bit more in through this area here. It's also going to be painful with squats and running and that kind of stuff. It's actually the more common presentation for those. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. Leave in the chat here where you're from and if you're training for anything specific. This week, we're talking about patellar tendon pain. So if you guys have questions, feel free to leave them in the chat there. We're just kind of getting started here. So like I was saying, patellar tendon pain, the presentation is very specific. It's usually pain right in this area, right underneath that patella, right underneath the patella. And one of the tests that we typically do is a decline squat. So basically you stand on a slant board and you just perform a squat. Typically it's a single leg squat. And if that's painful, then you're loading the patellar tendon. So that pain with that test plus pain localized right underneath the patella, you can typically be pretty confident, especially if there's a history of overload or a sudden spike in load. So it can be somebody who's running a 5K or 10K who hasn't trained for it at all. And then all of a sudden they started running and then they started to develop pain on the bottom side there. Is typically what you're looking at there. And so when it comes to rehab, the rehab is really just strengthening the patellar tendon. And because the quads help to extend the knee, so for here, when the quads contract, they extend the knee, which means that our rehab for patellar tendon pain is to strengthen the quads as well as the patellar tendon by extension, pun intended. And with any sort of tendon rehab, the big emphasis is to perform them slowly. A lot of times when we look at rehab, they're performed way too quickly because you're trying to get through your rehab as soon as you can. But the problem is that tendons are kind of dumb. And if you load them too quickly, they don't actually sense the load, they don't adapt. And then all of a sudden, you could be doing your rehab for a couple of weeks and you're not really getting better. and it's because you're performing the exercises too quickly, and so the tendon isn't responding to the load. And so, no matter what you're doing, typically a decline squat is one of the more common rehab exercises to do, but knee extensions and all that kind of stuff, um, you want to perform them slowly. Hi, Julie. Oh, um, welcome, Julie. And so you want to perform the exercises slowly, and that typically means each rep should be over 3 to 4 seconds when you're looking specifically at each muscle contraction. So the entire movement should be over 6 to 8 seconds. So typically, if we're looking at the movement, let's say we're doing a knee extension, so we're sitting like this, it would be 1, 2, 3 through the concentric contraction, and then 1, 2, 3 through the eccentric contraction. And if you're not familiar with the different kinds of muscle contractions, a concentric contraction is when you contract the muscle and the muscle actually shortens. So for the biceps here, um, if we look here, if I contract this way, the bicep muscle is actually shortening as it's contracting. So that's a concentric muscle contraction, where an eccentric muscle contraction is where it's lengthening as it's contracting. And when we look at tendon issues specifically, the eccentric muscle contraction is typically the thing that gets a lot of emphasis, but we actually don't need to necessarily just isolate the eccentric muscle contraction. Um, Hello, billionaires. Hello again, Julie. Just started running and getting pains everywhere, especially my hips. Oh, I'm glad the videos have been helpful. Uh, you know, uh, when you first start running, it's pretty common to have some generalized soreness everywhere. But obviously, it depends on your preparation as well. So I'm glad the videos are helpful because if you can kind of get a jump start on a lot of the strengthening stuff, specifically for lower extremity, looking at the calf muscles, looking at the quads, looking at the hamstrings and glutes, just strengthening everything up so that way you can tolerate more loads as you start to run. Um, is fantastic. So glad the videos are helping. Um, and so as we were talking about patellar tendon rehab, the first thing is just to make sure each of your contractions are slow. Like I said, tendons are kind of dumb. They need a lot more time to be able to adapt to the loads. Um, and the other part there is that as you're loading them, you have to load them over a long period of time. One of the big issues when looking at patellar tendon rehab is that the exercises are performed too quickly. Um, and so people expect the tendons to be able to adapt in maybe like 2 to 3 weeks, but it takes a lot longer. Most rehab programs are actually over 12 weeks. So you have to be patient when you're loading, specifically for the patellar tendon, but really for any sort of tendon pain syndrome. So, one, perform each exercise slowly, 6 to 8 seconds. That's 3 to 4 seconds for an eccentric contraction, and 3 to 4 seconds for the concentric contraction, and then performing them over 12 weeks. Um, but the nice thing is that you don't have to perform them every day necessarily. It is helpful if you perform them several times per week, though. I typically like the minimum is 3 times per week, depending on how heavy you're loading. Um, I'm a chiropractor, is what my license is. Um, but yes, I guess, um, in a sense, a doctor of chiropractic specifically, I suppose. Um, what were we just saying? Sorry. Performing each exercise over 6 to 8 seconds for each contraction, and then performing the exercises over 12 weeks. The minimum amount is 3 times per week, and it depends on how much you're loading. That's for a heavy, slow resistance protocol. So, obviously, as the name implies, the slow portion is each contraction over 3 to 4 seconds, and then you want to load heavy. So, for patellar tendons, they need a lot of load. If you think about the loads with running or especially with jumping, uh, as you jump, right? So we extend and then land. Um, it's a lot of load on the patellar tendon. And so if you're just doing some sort of body weight exercise, like a squat or a lunge or like a wall sit, the load, while tolerated, isn't going to be enough typically to cause structural changes to the tendon. So you need to load heavier with some sort of weight or something like that. So the slow, heavy resistance protocol, slow, heavy resistance protocol. Injured my Achilles heel. What exercises do you recommend? Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends. Hello, hello, welcome. Obviously, if we're talking about tendons in general, everything that we're kind of saying for patellar tendon pain is very similar to what you would do with Achilles tendon pain. You would typically, first of all, I guess you have to make sure that it is the Achilles tendon and it's not something different. And then I actually posted a video. I don't think I've actually posted on YouTube yet, but I did post it on my Instagram. With Achilles tendon pain, you want to make sure that you know the different types. So there's mid portion, which is the more common type. If you're to kind of just like pinch on your Achilles tendon, so typically you would pinch somewhere in this vicinity here, that's what's referred to as a mid portion Achilles tendinopathy. And that's by far the more common presentation, especially if you just started running. There's a lot of loads that go on the Achilles tendon. And so for that one, typically, if you just spiked your load, you're going to want to rest maybe a little bit for a couple of days just to see if it calms down. But if it's been going on for a long period of time, then you probably want to do some strengthening, which is with a heel raise. Uh, Same principles like we were just talking about with the patellar tendon. You have to perform them slowly because the Achilles tendon is also slow to adapt to loads. So you need to perform them overall over 6 to 8 seconds. So it's a 3 to 4 second contraction up as you lift the heel up off the ground, and then 3 to 4 seconds back down to the ground. A lot of times, even I guess most tendons, there's one on each side, obviously, and so typically you try to do them single leg, so you're loading that one side. But to reduce the load, then what you would do to reduce the load, you would do both. And if you wanted to isolate the eccentric component, you would go up on both, lift one leg up, and then drop the other heel. It's not necessary to do that, but that could be helpful. Born with short Achilles tendons. Advice for me. Phew, depends how short. Obviously, um, you can do eccentric loading to see if you can lengthen them a little bit. The question is like how much longer can you actually make them, right? Tendons typically they don't change all that much after childhood, and so that's also one of the problems. And one of the interesting things when we look at tendons in general is that potentially one risk factor is how active you were as a child. And it's because that's when the tendon is most adaptable to load. And so if you played sports as a kid and ran around, moved, and all that kind of stuff, your tendons will get stronger during that time period. But as an adult, they don't adapt or they adapt much slower. And so potentially one of the risk factors is how active you were as a kid. And so if you're dealing with a shorter Achilles tendon, which I would obviously ask, like, how do you know it's short? Because there's a lot of variation in terms of the tendon. And this is a little bit, uh, how to phrase this. When we look at the tendon, so there's the structure of the tendon, there's actually like two different portions to it. There's the free tendon, which is the part that's not attached to any of the muscle. And then there's tendon actually attached into the muscle as well. I don't have a rubber band here, but basically, if you kind of think, I have a pen. So if we look at the Achilles tendon, for example, let's see if we can keep this up here. You can have part of the Achilles, this is not going to work, but you can have part of the Achilles tendon here, which is not attached to any of the calf muscles. And then you would have the other portion in through here, which is attached. I don't know if that was a great representation. I should have grabbed an exercise band before I started, but hopefully that makes sense. And so your Achilles tendon, the free tendon portion, which is the part you would probably be able to see if you just kind of looked at your Achilles tendon. that portion might be shorter, but the actual length of the full tendon is the same. You just have more intramuscular tendon versus free tendon. What that means in terms of injury risk and all that kind of stuff, I think they're unknown at this point. But you can try to do some calf strengthening stuff. How important is it to actually lengthen the Achilles tendon for something like that? I think you could also, that's debatable. Just the injured area, getting up from a chair, right foot injury. Um, yeah, it depends where. Like if it's actually on the back of the foot or not, because obviously, um, if you're looking at different injuries into this area, Achilles tendon is here. You can obviously have a calf strain up and through this area. I guess just for reference, this is the front of the shin. This is the back, so the calf muscles are here. The plantar fascia is down through here, so that's another injury possibility there as well. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I guess getting back to, I love the questions. Keep putting them in the chat there. Happy to answer anything as we kind of go along. I'm so sorry to hear that, Zach. Oh, yeah. That's it's always a tough scenario. One, bullying in general, like terrible. So sorry. Especially like it just shouldn't happen. But same kind of, I guess, like a similar conversation of like if you fracture something and then you're put in a boot, for example, there's going to be shortening of the muscles, the tendon, all that kind of stuff. um, and it can be hard to lengthen that over that time. You can try your best to kind of see. I think one of the interesting things that we see, just kind of like in general, is the structure doesn't always dictate pain necessarily. So even if you have some sort of abnormality of the anatomy, let's say, doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be pain per se. Um, it's kind of interesting because, like, when you look at function, there's some parts of, like, when we look at actual stiffness of the tendon, which is, I guess this will be an interesting part. If you think about tendon stiffness, if somebody says they feel stiff in an area, they're like, oh, I need to stretch it out. It's a bad thing. But stiffness in the tendon is actually really good. And because tendons typically act as springs with movement, especially running, you want a stiffer spring because it's more efficient. As soon as you compress it, it recoils the energy, which makes running, walking, all that kind of stuff less metabolically demanding. And so you actually want your tendons, specifically the lower extremity tendons, so the patellar tendon and the Achilles tendon specifically, to be stiffer. Um, but obviously, if you have a fracture or something like that where you had to be booted or something like that, that stiffness can kind of change some of the mechanics a little bit, but not necessarily pain per se. Um, but yeah, hopefully you're doing well now, Zach. And yeah, uh, you know, just trying the best to strengthen the area as much as possible is probably what you would be looking at doing. Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. Hello, everyone. Thanks everyone for joining. Um, if you guys are just joining for the first time, we are talking specifically about patellar tendons was the general topic of this live, but we're answering everything. And so, yeah, if we go back to patellar tendon pain, the exercises that you would typically do. So typically, you would break up the rehab into three different sections: isometric, isotonic, and then plyometric. Isometric is a contraction of the muscle without any joint movements. Typically, this would be when you would, if the area is really sensitive to loading and just everything is irritating it. So, for the patellar tendon, you could look at something like a wall sit, would be the most common example, where you're contracting the quad, but there's no movement at the knee. Generally, you want to hold these for 30 to 45 seconds. If you guys are familiar with the Spanish squat is kind of like it's like a wall sit, but much, much harder. And essentially, if you think about a wall sit, but then flipped it around so you don't have the wall for support, that's essentially a Spanish squat. And the Spanish squat became a very, very popular exercise because there was a research study that found holding that Spanish squat for 30 to 45 seconds for 3 to 5 repetitions basically reduced your pain down to zero. And you'll see a lot of videos that will claim that this one exercise will cure your patellar tendon pain. And it's based off of that one research article. The problem with that research article, though, is that I think there was only maybe 7 people included in that study, and so there was actually a replica study which had a bigger population. I think that one maybe had like 20 people, and they found that the response to isometric exercises was variable, and so not the magic exercise that it was thought to be. Still can be helpful. And if you're looking at an exercise to start loading the patellar tendon, isometric exercises are perfectly fine. The Spanish squat's a nice one because it's a higher intensity exercise, which could be beneficial, but it's not a magic exercise necessarily. Most of the research still points to isotonic loading, which is concentric and eccentric muscle contraction. So basically, you're actually moving through the full range of motion of the joint. And so one of the most common ones is a decline. Hello, William. Welcome. One of the most common exercises is a decline squat. So basically, you would go on a decline slant board. I think typically 25 to 30 degrees is what you'd be looking at. It's not that important to have that specific decline, but then you would just do a squat. And typically they are single leg squats, although if it's too sensitive, you can obviously do a double leg squat to just reduce the load by roughly 50%. And then you don't have to isolate just the eccentric muscle contraction either. So 3 to 4 seconds down, 3 to 4 seconds back up with that decline squat, trying to load through that full range of motion. Exercises for torn knee tendon. It depends. It depends how much of it is torn, 25, 50, 75, 100%. But really, when you're looking at rehab, there's only so many different ways that you can load an area, right? So if we're looking at the knee tendons, typically there's two. The quadriceps tendon, which is, if we look at the front here, kneecap here, quadriceps tendon attaches the quads onto the kneecap, but then you also have the patellar tendon down here, which attaches the patellar tendon to the tibia here. But both of those will extend the knee, so both of those are going to be quad dominant exercises. It's just after a tear. Well, I guess if you have a tear, the question is, do you need surgery to repair it? And then the rehab is just a much more scaled down version, because most tendon rehab, um, you're looking at loading heavier, right? But if there's a tear, you're probably not going to load quite as heavy in general, especially if it's an acute tear, uh, because you need to let the tendon heal. But um, it's just kind of like a sliding progression there, if that makes sense. Does having knee crepitus with an exercise mean it is loading the tissue more? Uh, Welcome back, Joshua. Say with straight leg raises, get crepitus sounds. Um, Crepitus is interesting because it doesn't, I don't think it means a whole lot, to be completely honest with you. Um, a lot of times when we're looking at it, obviously, like the knees, it's a simple joint, but it's also complex. You have a capsule here. You obviously have your ACL and PCL ligaments here, which I guess not necessarily represented by this bar, but for all intents and purposes, I guess you could say that it kind of is. You have a ligament on the outside, or sorry, on the inside here, and then on the outside as well. And so you can have crepitus maybe coming from the knee or in between the kneecap here and the leg. So there's a joint. Oh, that didn't show very well. Oh goodness. There we go. There's a joint there which is called the patellofemoral joint in here, and so you can have crepitus coming from that area. As long as it's not painful, I usually don't put too much emphasis on crepitus, and so it's kind of, I guess, annoying. But one of the interesting things is that if you have crepitus and it's something that's kind of annoying, is that glute activation sometimes seems to reduce it. And it just has to do with the mechanics of the joint. Is that if you're, so this is the outside part of the knee, let's say you're bending the knee and you kind of rotate this way. If you have some glute activation and you're here, and it just cleans up the mechanics a little bit, sometimes it can get rid of the crepitus. And so you can do a squat, right? And if that's what you get crepitus with, you can put an exercise band around the knees and then push out for a little bit more glute activation and then see if that decreases the crepitus. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on where the crepitus is actually coming from. But that could be helpful. Uh, da, da, da. At what point can I say that I've done enough physio for hip dysplasia that is causing instability, muscle compensations, the upper back, and sometimes? Uh, that's a good question, William. I mean, with all rehab, the goal is whatever you're having trouble with to be able to do that, right? And so y- you've done enough physio or rehab or anything like that. Once you're able to do whatever it is, either because you have better mobility, because you have less pain, or because you have more strength and tolerance to load. So it really depends on what your goals are. For example, if somebody just wants to be able to um, get in and out of a chair, right? And let's say they have patellar tendon pain, for example, uh, the strength demands aren't that high, nor is the range of motion. Versus maybe it's somebody who's an NBA basketball player. That rehab's going to probably take a lot longer or be more intense because you're trying to get back to more explosive loading. And so um, the rehab really just depends on like what you're trying to get back to. And then obviously there's various factors of kind of like, metabolic conditions, for example, not necessarily related to hip dysplasia, but if we're looking at tendons, for example, if you have high cholesterol, if you have diabetes, if you have a tear, like all those factors are going to contribute to how long rehab is going to take potentially. Um, what if you have VMO, tendonitis, and patellar? Um, I mean, I don't know. I guess technically you could have VMO tendonitis. So, VMO is a small muscle on the inside portion here. It was thought to do a lot with kneecap stability, in that if it was weak, the patella would track abnormally and abnormality. Well, I've been reading too many radiology reports. But the VMO would be weak, and the patella would track in a different direction. So there was a big emphasis on VMO. The tendons typically blend a little bit, and so it'd be hard to say that the VMO tendon specifically. Like I would just say that it's the quadriceps tendon. Um, when we're looking at patellar tendon rehab versus quadriceps tendon rehab, the quadriceps, because it's on the top portion here, it actually needs to be loaded in deeper knee flexion. And so if you're doing knee extensions, for example, you have to have your knee flexed much more and then load it in this direction versus the patellar tendon where you can load in through this area and get the load on the patellar tendon that way. And so potentially, if you have quadriceps tendon pain and patellar tendon pain, one of them might be worse than the other, which might dictate which one you start off with. So if you have patellar tendon pain, which is really irritating, then you might have to focus on that because you might have to start with isometric exercises, for example, because it just doesn't tolerate much range of motion. And so you have to work on that to build up the tolerance to then get through something else. Um, and so it really depends on which one is more irritable, and that kind of dictates which one you start off with. But the nice thing with quadriceps and patellar tendon rehab is that they're fairly similar, right? They're both knee extensor mechanisms. And so if you're doing rehab for patellar tendon, for the patellar tendon, you're probably getting some carryover for the quadriceps as well, and then obviously vice versa. So the glutes that are active during step up is why. Laura, let me see here. Is why. Sometimes, I mean, like with straight leg raises, your knee really isn't moving all that much. And so if you're getting crepitus in the knee, because crepitus is typically with movement of that joint. And so if you're doing straight leg raises, I guess like is the crepitus actually coming from the knee or is it coming from like the hip, for example? And I guess is it actually crepitus per se? Sometimes people with a straight leg raise will get hip popping, which is typically the hip flexor tendon popping over part of the bone up in through here. Um, but uh, yeah, like knee crepitus specifically, a lot of times, like a little bit of glute activation does help um, to decrease that. But again, it just depends on where the crepitus is coming from and what the cause is. Lowest, uh, rephrase that question, Joshua. Lowest uh, in terms of like lowest load, um, uh, isometric loading would typically be the lowest or the easiest progression to start off with, just because you have the most control over the position that you're loading in. So you could do a wall sit, for example, and change how much knee flexion you're loading into. That's probably the easiest of the exercises. You can replicate that with a leg extension machine as well, because you can kind of extend the knee to whatever position is most tolerable. Um, yeah, that's probably the lowest progression on it. The interesting thing, though, is there was a research article that came out that looked at what was the actual premise? But basically, what they found is that if somebody experiences pain with an exercise, typically the load is reduced. And what they found was that actually didn't really change much. If the tendon is irritated with load, it's kind of just irritated with load regardless of the intensity. And so what they actually recommended was to stay with the same intensity because it doesn't actually change or negatively change the outcomes. So uh, if you're doing, oh, I don't know, I guess for example, if we did an isometric exercise, so if we did Spanish squat versus a wall sit, and the Spanish squat led to some discomfort in the knee temporarily, and the wall sit was totally fine. Most of the time, people would reduce to a wall sit because it's more tolerable in terms of pain. But the problem is because it's loading less, you're getting less tendon adaptation, and so it's probably not strengthening the tendon quite as much. And so they actually recommended to stay with the higher intensity exercise instead. And so uh, you obviously want to find a load that's tolerable because, like we've talked about in previous sessions here, there's a couple of different criteria when we look at how much load is appropriate. One is that we don't want the pain to interfere with sleep because sleep is very important for recovery for most injuries. Um, we don't want the pain to be elevated compared to baseline 24 hours afterwards. And then we also want to be able to do our normal activities during the day. So if you're loading too heavy and you can't go up and down stairs or you can't get out of a chair because your knee pain is too severe, for example, then that means you've overloaded the tendon way too much. And so, assuming you can do all three of those things, then the load is appropriate. Broke my ankle twice in the past. Even moving the one that, not sure. Wait. Broke my ankle twice in the past. Now get crepitus, even moving it. Yeah, I mean, whenever you have a fracture to an area, it'll definitely change my my string. What happened? Um, um, I didn't even realize my string was in my was like tucked in. Anyways, um, yeah, whenever you have a fracture, it changes some of the mechanics, depending on kind of like the complexity of the fracture as well. Um, but yeah, you can have crepitus and stuff like that after a fracture. That's pretty common. Does it have to do potentially with the rehab after the fracture? Maybe. Um, you know, if you had a fracture, were in a boot for 6 to 8 weeks, do you have different strength, or is your strength different? Yes, of course. You were immobilized for 6 to 8 weeks. The strength is going to be reduced. Your mobility is going to be reduced, and so there's an impact to that. And so, did the rehab get you to 100% afterwards? So and it takes a while, in consistency. So it's not uncommon after a fracture to have those kind of things, but that's why rehab is kind of complex because it's not like you magically go into a boot or something like that and then you do rehab exercise and everything goes back. Um, It'd be great if that were the case, but there's other factors and different variables that contribute. Obviously, fracture is one thing, but if we relate it back to tendons, for example, typically when we think about tendons, the emphasis is on load and the tolerance to load specifically. And so, if you have Achilles tendon pain, if you have patellar tendon pain, if you have gluteal tendon pain, whatever it is, you just need to strengthen that tendon. You need to load it, load it, load it, 70% of max. That's what you need to do. And the problem is that there's other things that contribute to tendon pain. Diabetes contributes because it impacts the ability of the tendon to heal. Same thing with high cholesterol. Same thing. Trying to think of the other factors, but basically, like in short, metabolic factors contribute to tendon health. And so, if you're either not getting better with doing rehab for, let's say, 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks, then maybe there's another factor here that's limiting your progression, which could be if you're diabetic, um, you that's definitely going to play a role. And so um, you have to be able to look at all the variables with rehab and account for some of those, and some you just don't know. Um, Somebody was talking earlier about the length of the tendon, for example. You know, could a somebody with a longer free tendon, typically, good lord, could potentially impact their rehab? Sure, it could. I don't know if we know that necessarily, and a lot of times, the only way to know what the actual structure of the tendon is would be to take an ultrasound or an MRI to be able to see how much free tendon versus intramuscular tendon you have. Um, but could that play a role? Sure. Um, it definitely could. So there's factors that you can test for. Blood work would obviously tell you diabetes, high cholesterol, that kind of stuff. Um, Imaging would tell you the actual structure of the tendon. But would you get an? I mean, a diagnostic ultrasound is available much more easily and it's cheaper. And so you can technically do that. Would you get an MRI for, you know, most Achilles tendon pain or patellar tendon pain cases? Probably not, because it's not really going to change your rehab that much unless you suspect that there's a tear and it's a substantial tear. Um, yeah. Um, Let me make sure I got all the comments here. Um, yeah. Uh, Thanks, guys, for being here. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Welcome if this is your first live that you've joined. I know like the title of this is patellar tendon pain, but we've covered a ton of other things as well. I think we've gone from hip dysplasia to, I think we had an Achilles tendon or a heel pain question. Um, we've gone through a bunch of different stuff, so feel free to leave them in the chat as well. Yeah. Let's see here. If we go back to patellar tendon pain, diagnosis we went through, rehab we went through. In terms of return to running, there's a couple of things to be aware of. One is that the quadriceps are most active during the braking phase, which is during that initial contact with the ground. And so if you overstride, for example, that impact will be higher. And so running cadence might be a important consideration there. And being that if you can load with the foot closer to underneath you, that'll decrease the braking forces with running, which will decrease the load on the quadriceps muscle and then therefore the patellar tendon as well. And so when you're looking at returning back to running, not necessarily running faster per se, but running with more steps per minute can be helpful to reduce the braking forces and therefore the load on the tendon. A lot of times when people are getting back into running after an injury, the thought is like, I'll go slower because it's safer. But the problem is that if you're running with reduced step rate, then you're actually increasing the loads on the tissues. That goes for plantar fasciitis, iliotibial band syndrome, patellofemoral pain, and then potentially patellar tendon pain. Did I say patellofemoral pain? Patellofemoral pain and patellar tendon pain. I don't actually. I might have mixed those up. Anyways, running cadence is an important thing when getting back into running, which just means increasing your step rate. So stride length, the distance in between your steps stays the same, but you're just taking more steps per minute to increase your running cadence. A tip for that is music. You can look up generally, most people run probably between like 150 and maybe 180 steps per minute. And so you can look on your apps if you use them. If you use, what is it, like an Apple Watch, or if you use Strava, you can see what your general step rate is. And then if you're looking at increasing it by 5 to 10%, you can look up playlists that have those beats per minute. And so as you're running, that will help you run to that pace, which is much easier than trying to like count. Um, Counting your steps would be absurd. Sorry, I meant if I try many things. I mean, it depends. The When you look at things like uh, so a common thing people will say is like, I've tried rehab or I've tried physical therapy or chiropractic or whatever it is, and it didn't work. The problem is like there's a lot of approaches for certain things. And so potentially whatever you were doing either plateaued, like you just stayed with the same thing for such a long period of time, and you need to take the next step in terms of like an exercise progression, for example, um, versus like, oh, it just doesn't work. Maybe it's a different exercise, maybe it's a different load, for example, because if you're trying to get back into running, for example, and you're just doing, I don't know, wall sits, um, are the loads on the patellar tendon, I know we're talking about hip here, but if the loads uh, during a wall sit are not the same as running, well, of course, every time you try to go running again, it's going to be painful because you're training for something that's lower than what you're actually going to experience. And so if it's like hip dysplasia, for example, um, potentially like if you're trying to squat, but you're not getting into enough hip flexion. Yeah, like it's going to be hard to build up tolerance to squatting if you're not getting into those positions. But you know, all these things really just comes down to whoever you're working with. You just want to have a conversation with them, and obviously be honest. Like, hey, I started. I don't know. Let's say I came in here. I was having a lot of hip pain, and I just wanted to be able to squat down to the ground, or I'm trying to go back into running. I'm trying to run my first marathon, and the exercises for a while helped or didn't help. But now I feel like I'm plateaued. I don't feel like I'm making progress. Like, is it a time thing? Is it you've only been doing the exercises for 2 to 4 weeks, so you wouldn't expect that many changes or in that amount of time, and you just need to do them for longer? Or is there a different approach that needs to be done? Or like with hip dysplasia, like, do you need surgery? You know, it's hard to say because uh, there's so many variables. Like I was saying, when it comes to like, oh, exercise didn't work for me or something like that, that you just need to be able to look at all those things and kind of see um, where not where the error is necessarily, but like what's are you missing something? One of the things that I talk a lot about, and this doesn't necessarily have to do with hip dysplasia, but the emphasis on like having good sleep. If you're experiencing chronic pain, one of the things that we know that increases pain sensitivity is a lack of sleep, and that's not something most people focus on. But if we're looking at like recovery from an injury, or if you're experiencing chronic pain, if your sleep quality or sleep quantity is just not sufficient, it's probably going to just keep coming back. Same conversation that we had with some of the other factors when it comes to tendon issues. If you're diabetic, if you have high cholesterol, if those things aren't addressed, then yeah, it doesn't matter how many wall sits or Spanish squats or decline squats you do. If there's something else that's a barrier to your rehab, then it's going to be hard to progress. They could be the best rehab program ever, but if there's other factors that are contributing, like, and that's why one of the common sayings is always like, when you see somebody, you're you have to look at the entire person and not just hone in on one area. If someone's dealing with patellar tendon pain, there might be the emphasis to zoom in and just look at that patellar tendon and go, yep, that's a load issue. We need to load it with 70% of max with the squat to get that tendon to adapt to be able to tolerate jumping or running. But there's a person that's attached to that tendon, right? You have to look at those other factors that could be potentially impacting them as well. So looking at everything, which hopefully that's helpful, William. But there's not a right or wrong answer there. You have to look at everything in the rehab program overall and try to figure out like what part of this maybe isn't for what part of this isn't is missing, I guess. Um, yeah, hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that's helpful there. Thanks everyone again for joining. If you're new here, welcome, first of all. Feel free to leave a comment. We're answering questions. Obviously, the theme this week is patellar tendon pain, but feel free to ask any other question as well. If you guys want, go ahead and just hit the thumbs up button. Give this video a like. It'll help. Um, but yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate it. Um, Hopefully everyone's Sunday is going well. Um, yeah, I don't know if any of you guys have been following NFL free agency, but it's been wild. It's been a wild free agency. Um, yeah, but yeah, trying to think of anything else for patellar tendon pain that we haven't addressed yet. because we went over diagnosis, we went over rehab, we went over return to running. We went over the three most common issues with the rehab. Uh, Again, not loading enough during each repetition. So each rep should be performed over 6 to 8 seconds. That way the tendon can sense the load, adapt to it. Most rehab programs need to be performed over at least 12 weeks. So even if the pain reduces, to actually get the tendon to change in structure, you need to load longer than just 2 to 3 weeks. Tendons are notoriously slow to adapt to load. Um, oh man. Yeah, you know, a lot of pelvic tilts, a lot of pelvic tilts, anterior, posterior. Um, Work slow and then just build your way up. Um, that's the way to do it, James. Um, yeah, you can go from cat cow and then go to a tall kneeling position and then right back up into standing. Um, Pretty simple. Um, let's see here. Loading tendons, 6 to 8 seconds. Rehab program over 12 weeks. Make sure you're accounting for all those other factors like we've been talking about. I've said it multiple times now. Diabetes, high cholesterol, those are the two main ones. But if you're not sleeping well, if you're stressed out, all those things can increase your pain sensitivity. So making sure that you're aware of those things. Obviously, when it comes to tendons are an overload condition. And so if you're continually overloading it, that's problematic. And so let's say you're dealing with Achilles tendon pain and you keep signing up for like 10 or 15Ks, it could be challenging. Obviously, you don't have to completely stop doing all activity with most tendon pain cases, but you need to make sure that your load management is under control. If you're continually overloading it, then that's going to be problematic. Um, what's interesting, I think, is when you hear a lot of rehab programs, um, people will tell people to stop doing everything, but in the research, they usually let them do everything within reason. If you can continue to run in some capacity, fantastic. If you have to temporarily switch out to maybe elliptical or a stationary bike just so you're limiting the impact forces, um, you might have to do that. But even if you're still doing that, you're still loading the quadriceps tendon, the patellar tendon, as well as like the Achilles tendon. Achilles tendon a little bit less with some of those, but um, you don't have to stop exercise in general, which is nice. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. Um, Kind of at the tail end of here, we're doing mostly Q&A. We've kind of talked to everything about patellar tendon pain so far. Diagnosis, rehab, return to running, all that kind of stuff. Trying to think of what we're doing. Posted a video on SI joint pain, or going to be posting a video on SI joint pain, which is kind of next up. If you guys have a specific topic that you guys want, let me know in the comments. You can comment on any video or this video specifically, and we can do that. Let me also know how you guys are liking the live videos here. This is the fourth one I think I've done. Usually I've only did video on demand. And so it's kind of nice to do these live videos where able to answer questions and all that kind of stuff. Because answering questions, I try to do my best on the videos, but there's obviously a lot, and a lot of them are context specific. It's how many should I do, and it's hard to say. Most rehab programs are somewhere between 3 sets of 10 to 15, but you know what's that person's background? Are they an athlete? Are they not an athlete? Are they trying to get back into something? Are they not trying to get back into something? There's a lot of variables there in terms of you know answering those questions. So it could be hard, but in a live, I can sit here and talk forever. Not that I would, um, but I think being able to add a little bit more context is helpful there. So, yeah. Any final questions as we kind of wrap things up? I appreciate all you guys being here. Um, Hopefully everyone has a good rest of their Sunday. And yeah, anything else before we wrap this one up here? Cool. Well, thanks again everyone for joining. Next week, I don't know if I'll actually have one next week. I'm traveling, but if I can, I will definitely do it. If not, it'll probably be the week after. But yeah, have a good weekend, everybody, and see ya.